Hello, back to Light in August. In my opening lecture, I examined Faulkner's introduction of his three protagonists, Lena Grove, Joe Christmas, and Gail Hightower, in the first three chapters, along with three secondary figures, Byron Bunch, Lucas Birch, alias Brown, and Joanna Burden. I suggested that in creating a triptych-like novel with three protagonists, Faulkner is experimenting in Light in August with a structure that gains its unity through counterpoint. Although Lena and Christmas never interact, they embody oppositional principles that are in tension with one another throughout the narrative. And in some ways, these oppositional elements are mediated by or combined in Hightower, who ministers to both Joe and Lena late in the novel. But I noted that unlike the antithetical concepts we find in The Magic Mountain, Faulkner doesn't deploy his directly or dialectically by bringing the characters together, and he doesn't do it as Mann does in any systematic fashion. Well, before we explore Hightower's meeting with Byron in Chapter 4 and then plunge into the scenes of Joe Christmas's past in Chapters 5, 6, and 7, I want first to propose a second mode of fictional unity in the book that binds this sprawling novel of ideas together. Like the contrapunctual model that I've described, this one grows out of Faulkner's deployment of characters, but in this case, it involves more than just the trio of protagonists. I'll call this second organizing mode interreflective oscillation. Oscillation refers to the quick movement back and forth between things, two objects, or two positions. What does Faulkner do in this respect? Well, throughout the novel, he creates characters who partially resemble and reflect one or more aspects of each other in their temperament or circumstances. We recognize these similarities between and among characters within the far-flung narrative, and they constitute, then, a kind of interreflecting network of kinships that stretch across decades in fictional time and across pages as we read. But this web of mirrored similarities isn't a static one or a consistent one. It oscillates because the characters whose traits are reflected in one another also exhibit striking differences from one another, or variations, if you will, within their kinship. To put it another way, they aren't perfect doubles in the sense of being full psychological replicants of each other, nor are they like Dostoevsky's or Mann's characters, who function as doubles by embodying submerged aspects of one another. Rather, in Light in August, we find a constant play of similarities and variations that creates a shifting constellation of characters mirrored in each other, but also distinguished from each other within that context of similarity. Faulkner's reader encounters, then, these crisscrossing lines of interreflexivity, and they have the effect of binding the diffuse characters together, in a sense, even when their storylines are largely unrelated. Let me give you a few examples of this interreflecting oscillation. Hightower and Joanna Burden are both social pariahs who are not native to Jefferson. Both of them are self-isolating figures, both bound by traumatic pasts that they cannot escape, and particularly by the legacy of their grandfathers, who were both killed decades earlier. As we've seen, both live in a place where they have been despised. But we'll see that whereas Hightower turns or tries to turn back toward the service of humanity, Joanna Burden makes a sudden and catastrophic turn toward the Calvinist God, in whose service Hightower tried and failed to preach years before. This is a crucial difference within the context of oscillating similarities. Here's another example. Consider the circumstantial similarities between Joe Christmas and his partner Lucas Birch as they are introduced. Unlike Joanna Burden and Hightower, who are paralyzed by their need to stay in Jefferson, both of these men are rootless. They're drifters who are hired to shovel sawdust before they collaborate as bootleggers. Both men also distrust women and mistreat them. Birch by abandoning Lena, and Joe Christmas by murdering Joanna. But whereas Joe Christmas is introverted, rebellious, and self-hating, a man who seeks primarily to injure himself, Birch, aka Brown, is a cowardly opportunist who loves to socialize and will do anything to escape discomfort. Faulkner indicates how the reader really is meant to negotiate such interreflective oscillations of likeness and difference when Byron Bunch thinks about the relationship between Joe Christmas and Lucas Birch. And we're told, I reckon the only thing folks wondered about was why Christmas ever took up with Brown. Maybe it was because like not only finds like, it can't even escape from being found by its like, even when it's just like in one thing, because even them too was the same like it was different. Christmas dared the law to make money, and Brown dared the law because he never ever had sense enough to know what he was doing it. Now the key phrase here in that passage is, even with the same like, they was different. And it will apply to numerous pairs and groups of characters in the novel, even those who make no direct appearance, in fact, in the novel. For instance, Joanna Burden as a nymphomaniac is one of the things that sort of draws her to Joe, because she is. But that nymphomania is clearly reflected also in Hightower's promiscuous wife, who, sexually unsatisfied in their marriage, took trips to Memphis. Both women, both Hightower's wife and Joanna, die violent deaths, one murdered, the other from a fall from a hotel window, and both exhibit signs of madness prior to their death. But whereas Joanna's hysteria manifests itself in obsessive religious atonement for her nymphomanic sins, Hightower's wife repudiates God and religion in the very church where he is preaching and embraces her hypersexuality. Now, these reflections or echoes across the novel then, from character to character, not only bind the novel structurally, but when they occur over time, they also have the effect of linking the past and the present. They remind us then yet again that in Faulkner's world, the past is never dead. It is always shaping and informing the character's present, quite beyond their conscious recollection or understanding or control. Faulkner reinforces this characterological interreflection that I've described by having the names of many of the characters echo one another: Birch, Bunch, Burden, Brown, Beard. These phonetical echoes, obviously deliberate, are meant, I think, to encourage our recognition of other connections among these characters. And one of the most striking ways that Faulkner employs this technique of oscillating interreflexivity is by linking characters through some aspect or circumstance or temperament, even when the characters seem fundamentally antithetical. For example, while we have seen that Lena Grove and Joe Christmas embody the polar oppositions of life and death, of love and hate within the novel's contrapunctual structure, the fact is that they also share certain things as well. Both are newcomers to Jefferson from other states, and both are betrayed by the same man, Lucas Birch, who abandons Lena when she is pregnant and who tells the sheriff that Joe Christmas is part black. So even then, the most antagonistic characters can reflect one another in complex ways. And we'll see this today, I think, with Joe Christmas and his foster father, the despised McGurkin. Christmas resents this brutal man, and yet he shares his brutality. In fact, even acquires some of the brutality from this foster father. So that to say that he hates McGurkin inevitably means that Joe hates those parts of himself that have been shaped or reinforced by and are reflected in McGurkin. To say that he hates McGurkin is in some way then to say that he hates himself. Okay, with this preamble in mind, let's turn to chapter 4, which opens on Sunday evening, the day after Lena has arrived in town and gone to the mill where she meets Byron Bunch, not Lucas Birch, whom she had hoped to find. And it is also this Sunday evening, the day after that Saturday when Joanna Burden was murdered by Joe Christmas, and that Joe Christmas fled. Now, the chapter is set in Hightower's obscure little house in town, where Byron visits him secretly a few times a week. These visits are Hightower's only connection to the world. Byron does not normally come on Sunday evening because he is usually away leading a country choir. But disruptions have occurred that change this schedule. And so Byron Bunch comes to Hightower both to disclose the troubling events that he has heard about and also to confess to Hightower, almost as if Hightower were still a man of God and not a defrocked minister. Before we analyze the substance of what Byron tells Hightower and why he knows it will so distress Hightower, it's important to note that Byron's account of the previous day's events is challenging for the reader in two ways. First, he presents things in the order that he received them, heard them, okay? Not in the chronology in which they actually occurred. So as in the novel as a whole, here, on a smaller scale, we have to convert the sujet or plot into the fabula or storyline. When we do, the chronology of the past 36 hours that Byron Bunch reports on goes like this. Early Saturday morning, the day before he is disclosing this, early Saturday morning, sometime before 7 a.m., Joe Christmas murders Joanna Burden, sets fire to her house, returns briefly to his cabin, and then flees the property. An hour later, Lucas Birch, alias Brown, sees the fire and also runs away. But Birch/Brown then returns to the cabin that he and Christmas shared, and he returns sometime before 11 a.m. that Saturday morning. That's when Hamp Walker and his wife see the smoke as they are driving by. Waller investigates, finds Brown drunk inside Joanna's house, pushes his way upstairs, and finds Joanna's body with her throat slit so deeply that she is nearly decapitated. Waller then notifies the authorities. The sheriff contacts Joanna Burden's closest living relative, who offers a $1,000 reward for her killer, a reward that Brown hears about and covets. That same Saturday afternoon, around 1 p.m., Lena Grove, having seen the smoke from a distance while riding in a wagon toward Jefferson, arrives at the sawmill outside town. Note that she is looking, as we note, for Lucas Birch, but finds instead Byron Bunch. As the two of them talk, she recognizes from Byron's comments and descriptions Birch, but not yet knows where he is. Seeing Lena's pregnant condition and admiring her courage, Byron, as we saw last time, immediately falls in love with her. He discloses that Birch is in the area, that he is known in town, but he does not tell Lena that her lover is a bootlegger living in a shack on Joanna Burden's property. He wants to spare her that. So instead, he takes Lena to a rooming house in Jefferson late Saturday afternoon. As they enter town, he tries to keep her away from the furor that is going on in the square. Byron doesn't yet know what this commotion is about, but he has a premonition that it would distress Lena, and he feels morally obligated to protect her from it. Thus, we are told that he decided, after they reached the square, to take Lena to Mrs. Beard's, and Byron, talking quietly, thinking, remembering, it was like something gone through the air, the evening, making the familiar faces of men appear strange, and he, who had not yet heard, without having to know that something had happened which made of the former dilemma of his innocence a matter for children, so that he knew, before he knew what had happened, that Lena must not hear about it. As so often happens in this novel, we find here an instance in which a character, invested with a sense of destiny, knows that something catastrophic has happened in advance of any conscious understanding of it. There's a feeling of destiny unfolding here for Byron, and it emerges not from any personal experience, but rather, it seems, from the internalized force of cultural history. This sense that something has happened, something is about to happen. Now, after settling Lena in Mrs. Beard's boarding house, Byron stays in town that night, and here's what it is that has been causing the commotion in the square when they had arrived. And then, late last night, he hears, Brown showed up. He was sober then, and he come into the square about 8 o'clock, wild and yelling about how it was Christmas that killed her, and making his claim on that $1,000. They got the officers and took him to the sheriff's office, and they told him the reward would be his all right soon as he caught Christmas. They caught Christmas and proved he'd done it. So Brown was told. He told then about how Christmas had been living with Miss Burden like a man and wife for 3 years, until Brown and him teamed up and began bootlegging. Well, the sheriff and marshal interrogate Brown, but Byron doesn't witness this interrogation directly. He is not one of the men, we're told, who pressed their faces to the window of the sheriff's office to try to watch and hear. That night, Lucas Birch, alias Brown, tells the authorities 2 things about Joe Christmas that spur the manhunt for him. First, he repeats that Christmas murdered Miss Burden, and thereby absolves himself in the process of any participation in the killing. And he told then about how he was afraid that Christmas would kill Miss Burden some night, and the sheriff asked him how come he never reported his fear, and Brown said he thought how maybe by not saying nothing he could stay out there and prevent it without having to bother the officers with it. About 7 o'clock, though, he said, Christmas come back into the cabin and stood there looking at Brown. I done it, Christmas says. Done what? Brown says. Go up to the house and see, he said. The second, more important disclosure that Brown makes is that Christmas told him, he claims, that he was part black. And this is Brown's most desperate ploy to throw all suspicion off of himself and to ensure Christmas' arrest, and he hopes, therefore, his collection of the $1,000 reward. Because, they said, it was like he'd been saving what he'd told them next for such a time as this. Yes, this is what he's been holding in reserve, Brown. Like he knowed that if it come to a pinch, this would save him, even if it was almost worse for a white man to admit what he would have to admit than to be accused of the murder itself. And what is it that he discloses that is so terrible? That Christmas told him, he claims, that he was part black. It's like he knew he had them then, like nothing they couldn't believe he would have done would be as bad as what he could tell that somebody else had done. You're so smart, he says. The folks in this town is so smart. Fooled for 3 years, calling him a foreigner for 3 years, when soon as I watched him 3 days, I knew he was no more a foreigner than I am. I knew before he even told me himself. Well, maybe he's drunk when he did tell it, but he done it. Well, I don't know. Anyway, the next morning, after he told me, he come up to me and he says, Brown was talking fast now, kind of glaring his eyes and his teeth both round them from one another, and he said to me, I made a mistake last night. Don't you make the same one. Now, you'll note that in disclosing this, as he is listening, Brown sees the effect that it is having on the sheriff and the marshal who are interrogating him. And as he says this, the marshal says, you better be careful what you are saying. If it is a white man you're talking about, the marshal says, I don't care if he is a murderer or not. The marshal's response to this act of betrayal is stunning. He holds Joe Christmas guilty for the racial transgressions he's committed, even if, as he suggests, Christmas didn't actually commit a murder. His reaction this Marshall's is compulsive and immediate, and it reveals the essence of the South's monstrous inheritance of racism that Faulkner reveals as the shaping legacy of the South, even when the novel is set in the 1930s. It's a legacy of ongoing vicious racial prejudice for some, like the Marshall, and of crippling racial guilt for others, like Hightower and Joanna Burden. The lawman's response here reveals that he regards the mixing of racial blood as a crime as serious or more serious than murder. I don't care if he committed murder or not. Clearly, he's guilty. That a black man was sexually cohabiting with a white woman, even a despised social outcast like Joanna, that is unforgivable. It's a violation of the South's enduring segregationist codes. And the crime is all the more outrageous, it seems, because Christmas has had the audacity to try to pass himself off for 3 years as a white man, thereby compounding his crime of miscegenation. Now, as a racist himself, Brown knows that they will believe his claims about Christmas's mixed race for two reasons. First, the charge of miscegenation is so damning, so absolute in this culture, that the Marshall holds that even a scoundrel like Brown wouldn't invent such a thing just to save himself. And second, they believe him because in making the disclosure, Brown must, of course, make the humiliating admission that he knowingly continued to share a cabin with this black man, that a man who is considered black at least. Because remember, any individual within this culture is considered black if there is even a drop of African American blood. That alone, legally and culturally, in Mississippi in the early 1930s, makes you a Negro. Well, the sheriff said, I believe you are telling the truth at last. Who would make such a thing up? Now, Brown's testimony is not just exculpatory, but of course it is also avaricious. He's hoping to claim the reward money proposed by Joanna's relative, and is so determined in this that this outcast, this good-for-nothing, joins the law in a manhunt to try to track down Joe Christmas. Well, given the obvious echo of Jesus Christ in the name Joe Christmas, and given the fact that Joe was found on an orphanage doorstep on Christmas Eve, we can't, I think, help but see Brown here as enacting the role of Judas in Joe's long crucifixion. He sells his friend out to torture and death for money, as Judas did with Christ, with the pieces of silver. This betrayal occurs late Saturday night. Now, that in town in the police office. The following evening, Sunday evening, Byron, of course, has come to tell Hightower what I have just described and presented in chronological form regarding the murder and Joe Christmas. But particularly, Byron wants to explain what he has done in the course of these events with Lena. He knows that the details of Joe Christmas's flight and Brown's betrayal of him are going to distress Hightower, this self-isolating man who has been doing private penance for 25 years and who wants nothing more to do with the community or the present world. Still, Byron knows this will move and disturb him. What Byron tells Hightower threatens to draw this man of God back into the world in the name of humanity and justice, and Byron foresees this. But before we examine what else Byron Bunch tells Hightower, I want you to consider for a moment the indirect way in which Faulkner presents this transmission of information about the murder. Okay? Faulkner's third-person omniscient narrator quotes Byron Bunch at length, and Byron, in turn, in telling this story, recounts what he heard from the townfolk, who in turn heard it from the sheriff, who in turn heard it when they interrogated Brown from Brown. And Brown, in his quoted testimony, quotes words allegedly spoken to him by Joe Christmas, as in, I done it, okay? Both before the murder, when Brown discovered his affair with Joanna Burton and immediately after the murder. So this is an extremely indirect transmission. For example, then Brown told, how he found out that night that sooner or later Christmas was going to kill her or somebody. He said he was lying there laughing, thinking that Christmas would just maybe get back in bed again, when Christmas struck a match. Then Brown said he quit laughing, and he laid there and watched Christmas light the lantern and set it on the box by Brown's cot. Then Brown said how he wasn't laughing, and he'd laid there and Christmas standing there by the cot looking down at him. Now you get a good joke, Christmas says. You can get a good laugh telling them in the barber shop tomorrow night. And Brown said he didn't know what Christmas was mad at, and he kind of said something back to Christmas, not meaning to make him mad, and Christmas said, in that still way of his, "You don't get enough sleep. You stay awake too much. Maybe you ought to sleep more." And Brown said, "How much more?" And Christmas said, "Maybe from now on." What are the implications of this technique in which we have a series of voices within voices, of quotations within quotations? Well, the first implication is that the method calls attention to the unreliability of memory, because everyone, including Brown, is reporting what they heard at some point earlier. In some cases, quite recently earlier, in other cases, days or weeks before. There is some slippage of truth, then, that seems inevitable in this, even if the various reporters are trying to be accurate in their recollections. And one might note that Brown's memory is decidedly selective and not very reliable, or particularly not reliable with regard to Joe at all. Also note that the voice at the center of this series of enclosed transmissions is that of Joe Christmas. And that's apt, because he similarly stands at the center of the novel and is contained there. His life is imprisoned in a certain sense, hemmed in on every side, much as his words here within Brown's testimony, which is reported and reported and reported and finally reported by Byron, much as Joe's words are enclosed at the very center of these layers of voices surrounding it. Indeed, throughout Light in August, we'll see Joe Christmas comes to us refracted through many different perspectives and many different eyes that misread or simplify this man, whose conflicted inner life we're going to understand only when we learn about his past and only when we enter his consciousness. Now, the outside perspectives we get on Joe are not entirely unreliable, beginning with the response of the men who first saw him walk in at the mill, but they're all partial and therefore all limited. In Light in August as a whole, we can only understand a character in the fullest sense through an accumulation of interior and multiple exterior perspectives, very much like what we would get, I suppose, in a Cubist painting by Braque or Picasso. Now, in his conversation with Hightower, Byron begins his monologue with a confession, as if he hopes for absolution from the defrocked cleric. He said he lied passively to Lena Grove by concealing from her Byron Birch's whereabouts and his illegal activities. And lying to the woman, he says, it was particularly wrong of him because, quote, with them eyes that a man could not have lied to even if he wanted to. She has a look that suggests you must be honest with her, and yet he was not completely honest, and he blames himself. Even though Byron lied or withheld information about Brown to protect Lena from additional pain over this unworthy man, even though he did that, he still feels guilty because he senses that he did it not just out of protective charity, but also out of a sudden love for her. He feels that he needs to renounce this love or any claim on the pregnant Lena because, after all, no matter how unworthy Brown may be, she belongs to him, belongs to another man. Now, even though he doesn't fully understand his feelings for Lena here, already he senses that, and this is what makes him feel guilty. He tells Hightower, I reckon she can find him now anytime she wants, provided him and the sheriff ain't out with the dogs. he ain't trying to run. Not with that $1,000 hanging over his head, you might say. I reckon he wants to catch Christmas worse than any man of them. He goes with them. They take him out of jail, and he goes along with them. So he says, I haven't told her yet. No, I ain't told her, nor him, because he might run again, reward or no reward. And maybe if he can catch Christmas and get the reward, well, maybe she'll marry him in time. But she don't know yet, no more than she knowed yesterday when she got down off that wagon in the square, swole-bellied, getting down from that very strange wagon among the strange folks, telling herself with a kind of queer astonishment, well, here I've come all the way clean from Alabama, and now I'm in Jefferson at last. Sure enough, this confession pours out of Byron, who feels guilty for desiring, to the extent that he allows himself to recognize it, another man's pregnant woman. Well, rather than offering Byron forgiveness for some kind of sin of dishonesty, instead, Hightower reassures him that he committed no sin at all, that in fact, in his treatment of Lena, he acted rightly. I cannot see what you have to worry about, Hightower says. It's not your fault that the man is what he is, or that she is what she is. You did what you could, all that any stranger could be expected to do, unless... Now, you will note here that from the start, Hightower listens, quote, as though to the doings of people of another race. So remote has he been from the community and from the present world for so long. But then, we're told, Hightower begins to sweat profusely as Byron describes the commotion in the town. And like Byron himself had felt the previous night, Hightower now feels a premonition, a feeling of a violent destiny that disturbs him. This reclusive man, who seems so emptied of life that Faulkner describes him as looking like an empty flour sack, suddenly takes on, quote, an expression of shrinking and denial in pain, suddenly comes to life in the form of acute distress. Now, Bunch knows the story of the murder and of Christmas's flight, and he knows in telling Hightower of this that the details are going to have the effect of making his friend absolutely agonized. Part Negro, Hightower says. Is that right? His voice sounds light, trivial, like a thistle bloom, falling into silence without a sound, without any weight. He does not move. For a moment longer he does not move, and then there seems to come over his whole body as if its parts were mobile, like face features, that shrinking and denial, and Byron sees that the still flaccid big face is suddenly slick with sweat. But his voice is light and calm. What about Christmas and Brown yesterday, he said, and wants to know more. Hightower knows what will happen to a man accused of sex and murder of a white woman, a black man who has done that. This is why he sweats. He knows from the beating he himself took on trumped-up charges as a white man accused of consorting with both a black woman and a black man. He knows what will happen. He knows the town will lynch Joe Christmas, whether he is guilty or not, just on the suspicion of his miscegenation, quite beyond any proof or not of the murder. Now, this is the kind of moral urgency and identification with others that Hightower has tried to avoid in his hermetic seclusion for years. He doesn't want to get involved, and yet, listening to this, ethically, he feels compelled to hear all of Byron's account and to respond to it, even at the cost of moral agony. It's certain, it's proved that he has Negro blood, Hightower said. Think, Byron, what it will mean when the people, if they catch poor man, poor mankind. Surely part of the pain that Hightower feels here, this anxiety and dread that grips him, is rooted in his own guilt as a man who, after all, glorified, and to some degree still glorifies, the Confederate cause of his grandfather, even though that grandfather fought in the name of the slavery that Hightower himself detests. Okay, well, we turn now to Joe Christmas's backstory, which will cover 8 chapters. But before Faulkner takes us all the way back to Joe's early childhood experiences, which shape so much of his character and his destiny in chapters 6 and 7, before that, we begin these extended flashbacks with a more recent one that takes us to his immediate past. It's the beginning of Faulkner's search for an understanding of Joe Christmas's life and death, his crime and punishment, but above all, the search for the roots of Joe's hatred of both races, his hatred of women, his hatred of religion, and above all, Joe's hatred of himself. All of these things will be unpacked because they are, after all, the forces of hatred that prompt the murder. Chapter 5, just before the murder occurs and leading up to it, is one of the richest tour de forces in the novel. It dramatizes the 24 hours in Joe's life from midnight to midnight, leading up to the crime. The interior presentation of his thoughts and feelings here also raises questions about the origins of those feelings and attitudes, the source or cause, if you will, the origin of his murderous aggression. And in raising questions about the underlying causes, of course, this chapter prepares us for the lengthy plunge into Joe's earlier history in the chapters that are going to follow. Well, in returning to the day before Christmas murdered Joanna, Faulkner is performing, of course, a temporal dislocation that we have already seen on a smaller scale earlier when we looped back briefly in time from Lena seeing the wagon on the road and knowing that it will pick her up to the scene of Armstead seeing Lena pass, which occurred before that, but comes to us afterward. As I noted, these temporal dislocations have 2 major functions. First, they remind us how the past constantly emerges and imposes itself within the lives of the present for Faulkner's characters. But second, these curious flashback dislocations convey to the reader the sense of destiny that the characters so often feel, of an event yet to occur that is fated and feels as if it has already taken place. When we read about events leading up to what we know has already occurred, the event toward which that flashback is moving seems predestined to us, in this case, Joanna Burden's death. Well, at the end of the flashback in chapter 5, we're told Joe Christmas rose and moved toward the house. We know that he is on his way to the house to murder Joanna, and he foresees this and feels compelled to enact it by a sense of inner destiny. And it is, quote, a murder that we've heard about, that is already something we're familiar with. So it is as if it has already occurred for us as well, much as Joe feels that it has already in some way occurred in his life because it is so fundamentally destined by his nature. Well, the chapter epitomizes, chapter 5, the conflicts at the center of Joe Christmas's life. And these conflicts manifest themselves in the surging drives he feels, but also in the voices within his mind. These voices are pushing him to, quote, do something, something that he doesn't consciously allow himself to identify or to recognize at first. But the voices persist. He was hearing a myriad of sounds inside, of no greater volume, voices, murmurs, whispers, of trees, darkness, earth, people, his own voice, other voices, evocative of names and times and places which he had been conscious of all his life without knowing it, which were his life thinking. Perhaps God and me not knowing that too. He could see it like a printed sentence, full-blown already, dead. God loves me too, like the faded and weathered letters on the last year's billboard. God loves me too. All these voices from the past echoing in his head. Now, repeatedly throughout the novel, Joe Christmas says to himself, all I wanted was peace. But both his inner voices and his instinctual urges give him no peace. And all of those, both the voices and the urges, are bound up with the past, with his inherited racial identity as both black and white, with the conditions of his conception, as we shall see, and with his very earliest years of life. These inheritances from before he was born and in very earliest moments of his life and years, these inheritances are so deeply rooted in Joe's psychic makeup, in his feelings and instincts, that he can never find peace, perhaps, except in death. Christmas's sense of a violent destiny, which he will not allow himself to name, but that nonetheless he feels approaching just before the killing, that sense of a violent destiny is so strong that even though he won't allow himself to use the word murder, he feels as if he has already committed murder, just as Lena, you remember, felt that she had already ridden in Absted's wagon even before it had arrived. This proleptic sense of a destiny so strong that it is as if it is already a fait accompli. Thus, we're told that as he kneels beside the spring, shaving, using the water's surface for a glass, stropping the light, bright razor on his shoe, he thinks, maybe I have already done it, he thought. Maybe it is no longer now waiting to be done. It seemed to him that he could see the yellow day opening peacefully on before him like a corridor in Arras into the still chiaroscuro without urgency. Maybe I've already done it. Well, as Joe thinks this, he is reading a crime magazine about other murders which have already occurred, as if his killing is similarly already pre-written, as if it's somehow a kind of past tense narrative. The chapter introduces several of the tropes that are going to continue to swirl around Joe Christmas throughout the book and that trace back to his childhood. These tropes include darkness, foul water, filth of all kinds, abysses, and the image of his own body. The chapter begins with Brown stumbling into the shack, drunk, laughing, which prompts Christmas to beat him and choke him. That violence, we soon realize, is a displacement of the aggression that Christmas feels for Joanna. He has been lying, Christmas has, in bed, unable to sleep, feeling a murderous compulsion toward her, but not just because she is white like Brown, for other reasons as well. We're told that he stood in the darkness above the prone body after he gets up, with Brown's beneath breath already hot and cold on his fingers, thinking quietly, something is going to happen to me. I'm going to do something. Without removing his left hand from Brown's face, he could reach with his right across his cot to the pillow beneath which lay his razor with its 5-inch blade. But he did not do it. That is, does not slit Brown's throat, perhaps thinking had already gone far enough and dark enough to tell him, this is not the right one. Well, what is the root cause of Christmas's hatred of Joanna, who has been his secret lover and has allowed him to make moonshine on her land, who has fed him and taken him in? Well, Joanna has reached menopause. The sex-starved woman who had initially craved Christmas, both as a man and as a Negro, has now infuriated him in several ways at this moment in her life. First, due to Joanna's diminished sexual response in menopause, she has frustrated him. But more deeply, she's frustrated him and angered him because of her sudden Calvinist-style repentance for her sexual sin. And most of all, she has infuriated him by her attempts to make Joe pray and repent with her. For Christmas, this religious mania is all too familiar as an echo of his earlier life with McGurkin. He despises Christianity and has rebelled against this severe Protestant creed in its more authentic form in McGurkin in his adolescence. But now he hears it again from Joanne, and he regards her professions not just as coercive and repressive, but also, to make it worse, he regards them as dishonest. He sees it as the hypocritical expression of a woman who, because she has grown too old to deny sex, now wants to deny it in him and lacerate it as an evil in both of them. Thus, he thinks, perhaps that is where outrage lies. Perhaps I believe that I have been tricked and fooled, that she lied to me about her age, about what happens to women at a certain age. He said aloud, solitary in the darkness beneath the dark window. She ought not to have started praying over me. She would have been all right if she hadn't started praying over me. It was not her fault that she got too old to be any good anymore, but she ought not and have not better sense than to pray over me. And he began to curse her as he stood beneath the dark window, cursing her with slow, calculated obscenity. Joe Christmas is clearly a misogynist, and we will see why when we go further back into his life. But his thoughts here about Joanna and the gestures we'll see that follow suggests that he hates and distrusts women for three reasons, I think. First, he believes they are inherently deceitful and dishonest, which, based upon his experiences we shall see later, he has some reason for. Second, he hates them because he believes they offer a sexual temptation to which he finds himself repeatedly yielding, but which he regards all the same as degraded and corrupt. And even though he despises and repudiates the Calvinist idea of sin, at some level he regards them as sinful as well, and feels that in some way he's been victimized by the erotic temptation the woman posed. And finally, his hatred is rooted in the fact that he thinks that women, Joanna included, all want to possess him, to encompass him, to enclose him in some coercive fashion, be it through offers of food, or sex, or clothing, or prayer. Now, we learn later that Joanne had wanted Joe to marry her, yet another attempt at possession, but Joe had resisted it. His fear of being possessed by a female is reflected in his refusal to be fully enclosed in any garment that he associates with a woman's work. The garment that he sleeps in at this point, having repudiated Joanna and women, is one that is nearly buttonless, because he associates buttons, the buttons that women sew on, with a kind of female power, with an immersion, if you will, not just into the filth that he associates with women sexually, but he regards the clothing that women tailor or repair for him as a form of sartorial confinement. And thus, we are given a description of Joe on the night before the murder, standing in the half-laugh light, watching and looking at his own, feeling his own body, wearing a light garment that has only one button at the top. He was not looking at the window. In the less than half light, he appeared to be watching his body, seeming to watch it, turning now slow and lascivious in a whispering of gutter filth, like a drowned corpse in a thick, still black pool of more than water. He touched himself with his flat hands, hard, drawing his hands hard up his abdomen and chest inside his undergarment. It was held together by a single button at top. Once he'd owned garments with intact buttons. A woman had sewed them on. That was for a time, during a time. Then the time passed, and after that he would purloin his own garments from the family wash before she could get to them and replace the missing buttons. And when she foiled him and set herself deliberately to learn and remember which buttons were missing and which had been restored, with his pocket knife and with the old bloodless deliberation of a surgeon, he would cut off the buttons which she had just sewn on, which she had just replaced. Buttons themselves become, in his mind, like clothing itself as fashioned by women, a form of female domination, of confinement. Women sew on buttons. Christmas doesn't want to be bound in any garment that he sees as symbolic of female power over him. Well, in cutting off those buttons on his clothing, sewn on by woman as a boy, that act of cutting the buttons foreshadows Christmas's cutting which is soon to follow here, of Joanna's throat, an act that he is just about to perform. As he stands naked in the passage I just read, without the nightgown, he repudiates womanhood again, because rather than going to Joanna's bed, where she often waits for him, even if she is no longer sexually available, instead he goes to the stables, which he thinks of as somehow purely masculine. He was walking quite fast then. He was thinking aloud now, why is it the hell I want to smell horses? And then he said, fumbling, it's because they are not women. Even a mare horse is kind of a man. Well, just before that retreat to the stables, Joe Christmas walks to the road and exposes his naked body to a car full of whites. It's an act of aggression that is both sexual and racial. I am a sexualized black man, essentially, but it's also designed to elicit horror and disgust and, he would hope, aggression against him in this car full of whites. It does not, and he's frustrated in a sense that it doesn't. Joe Christmas watched his body grow white out of darkness, like a Kodak print emerging from the liquid. He looked straight into the car headlights as it shot past. From it, a woman's shrill voice flew back, shrieking, "White bastards," he shouted. "That's not the first of you bitches that ever saw." But the car was gone. Note how we're often told that Joe Christmas exhibits or looks at or examines his own body, either by gazing at it, say in the reflection of the water as he's shaving, or feeling it with his hands, or presenting it to others. This habit of somehow looking at himself or wanting his body to be seen points toward Joe's racial uncertainty, because his racial status is not clearly written on his body. Thus, it must somehow be scrutinized. But this preoccupation with the appearance of his body also reflects Joe's anxieties of passing for white, as he has been doing. At the same time, however, this morbid preoccupation with how he looks also suggests that deeply he hates his own flesh precisely because it is both black and white, and he despises the very mixed race that has made him flesh. He feels that his body is corrupted both by sexual desire and by his blackness, and to some extent also by his whiteness. But both the sexual desire and his blackness in particular are aspects of his being that he associates with filth and dark water, just as he also associates women with those contaminate images. As we'll see, blackness and womanhood are closely aligned in his mind. Well, the following evening, Christmas, finds himself walking into town without knowing why. He feels that he is pulled there. Still, it's on the verge of the murder, but he has not yet formulated it yet. He feels that he is pulled there by a kind of tropism that recalls Gerald Critch in Women in Love. But in Faulkner, this impulse, this unconscious will, if you will, arises not from the Freudian unconscious, as it does for Lawrence, but rather it arises in Joe Christmas from the force of historical and infantile memories that are not even conscious. As he walks through Jefferson, we're told, that though he was not large and not tall, he contrived somehow to look more lonely than a lone telephone pole in the middle of a desert. In the wide, empty, shadow-brooded street, he looked like a phantom, a spirit strayed out of its own world and lost. And then he found himself. Without his being aware, the street had begun to slope. And before he knew it, he was in Freedtown, surrounded by the summer smell and the summer voices of invisible Negroes. They seemed to enclose him like bodiless voices, murmuring, talking, laughing in a language not his. As from the bottom of the thick black pit, he saw himself enclosed by cabin shapes, vague, kerosene-lit, so that the street lamps themselves seemed to be further spaced, as if the black life and the black breathing had compounded the substance of breath, so that not only voices, but moving bodies and light itself must become fluid and accrete slowly from particle to particle of and with the now ponderable night, inseparable August.1. The sense of liquid blackness all around him, drawing him. Now, Joe is instinctively drawn to the black quarter of town, but the problem is that as a man of mixed race, he isn't drawn there with any expectation of finding a place of his own in the world or a home. He is accepted nowhere. He is perpetually lost, perpetually isolated, like a telephone pole in the middle of a desert, we're told. So as he moves there with a kind of unconscious propulsion, he's not seeking a home there, nor will he ever be able to seek one later that night in the white part of Jefferson. Rather, Christmas knows that he'll always be an alien in both these worlds, and yet he's compelled by his hatred for both sides of his biracial nature to suffer again and again encounters with these two worlds, black and white, whose conflicting legacies are present within him, both in his blood and in his personal history. It's inherently a kind of self-punishing impulse within him. He visits these different precincts of Jefferson, black and white, precisely because he hates them and hates what each has contributed to his own intolerable existence. Christmas would like to destroy the black and white worlds and himself, and it is this racially conflicted urge both to kill and be killed that drives his unconscious movements the night before the murder into these sectors of town that fill him with both hatred and self-hatred. First, he wanders, as we've seen, into Freedtown, the black district founded by freed slaves, only then, immediately thereafter, to realize where he is and, in horror, run away. On all sides, even within him, the bodiless, fecund, mellow voices of Negro women murmured. It was as though he and all other man-shaped life about him had been returned to the lightless, hot, wet, primogenitive female. He began to run, glaring, his teeth glaring, in-breath cold on his dry teeth, and his lips forward toward the next street lamp. And he stopped there, panting and glaring, his heart thudding and thudding and thudding. Now, remember that Joe was raised by whites, first at the orphanage and then by McGurkin. And as such, he has assimilated a white, sort of internalized, white racial hatred for blacks. And so, of course, he despises the part of himself that is black and that he keeps hidden. And he would therefore like to flee himself or flee the black part of his own nature, much as he flees the black quarter of Jefferson. But Christmas also doesn't just despise his own blackness, he also fears it, even though, as I've suggested, he's drawn again and again to confront it in a way that is ultimately self-destructive. He associates his blackness fearfully with being engulfed in a foul-smelling black abyss, which he sees and feels as he is walking through Freedtown. Loathing and fear. More curiously, though, he also, in the passage I just read, associates this dark, fluid world of Negroes with the feminine. He senses that both Negroes and women threaten to enclose him and engulf him in a realm of corrupt hypersensuality. Thus, the wet primogenitive female is also black. Blackness and femininity, both of them hypersexual and corrupt, reflecting, of course, his hatred for that hypersensual negritude within himself. So then, when he realizes where he is, he runs away, as he has run away that night from the threat of womanhood at Joanna Burden's. But he also runs away at this moment from something much more practical. He runs away from Freedtown because of the threat of racial exposure. Being there, we're told, quote, had almost betrayed him as black. That is to say, no white man would ever think of entering this, quote, black pit, so that he would then be seen and possibly threatened as a white man. It would in some way have exposed him, betrayed him in that sense. Yet, so strong is Joe Christmas's self-destructive fascination with blackness that a little later that night, he again enters a different black community outside of Jefferson. This time, he is mistaken for a white man, as he feared he would be when he entered Freetown. And again, he goes there without any conscious intention, but is drawn there because, quote, his blood was again talking. He's following the directive of his instincts and attitudes, that entered his being before Joe Christmas was ever born, an instinct of both racial identification with this black world and also revulsion from it. So strong is that revulsion, so strong is his hatred of blackness, both around him and within himself, that when he sees on the outskirts of town a group of black men, he moved, quote, as if he intended to walk them down. He moves toward them with aggression. What he wants to do is, of course, initiate a fight in which he would be beaten, as he has so often been beaten in these kinds of encounters in the past, because he so deeply hates himself. "It's a white man," the man said, without turning his head quietly. "What do you want, white folks? You looking for somebody?" And then the Negro's head seemed to float away. A cool wind blew from somewhere. Christmas, turning slowly, watching them dissolve and fade again into the pale road, found that he had the razor in his hand. It was not open. It was not from fear. "Bitches," he said quite loud. "Sons of bitches. What in the hell is it a matter to me?" he thought. He put the razor back in his pocket and stopped and lit a cigarette. Just as he could say when he was ready to kill Brown, "No, this is not the one." Again, he says it now, though he is certainly tempted to want to kill precisely so that in the process he can be killed. The urge to aggression here is ultimately directed at himself. Now, Joe Christmas's passage through the white part of town between his journeys into the black sectors also fills him with hatred and aggression. But in this case, it's not triggered by his white fear of being sucked into the abyss of black filth, but rather by his black resentment of being inherently excluded from this privileged world of verandas and front porches and shade trees. We're told after passing out of Freetown, he went on slowly again, his back toward the square, passing again between the houses now of white people. There were people on the porches too, and in the chairs upon the lawns, but he could walk quiet here. Now and then he could see them, heads in silhouette, a white blurred garmented shape. On a lighted veranda, 4 people sat about a card table, the white faces intent and sharp in the low light, the bare arms of the women glaring smooth in the white above the trivial cards. That's all I wanted, he thought. Why don't seem like a whole lot to ask? But he can't have it. His resentment is incandescent. Now, we realize that for Joe Christmas, ultimately, Joanna Burden is the right one to murder, not a black man, not Brown. And she is the right one to murder, even though he has not yet admitted it quite to himself. She's the right one because she is a contaminated and possessive female. That's part of it. And because of her religiosity. That's part of it. But also because of her race. It is, after all, her whiteness, combined with Joanna's fetishizing of Joe's blackness, that he despises most deeply in her of all, and that makes her, above all things, the right one against whom he must channel and direct his hatred of the world and himself. He cannot bear that Joanna loves in him his blackness, because it is that blackness that he abhors in himself. So, hating both the white and the black blood in himself, Joe Christmas strikes out, not just against Joanna in slitting her throat, but in doing so strikes out against himself, against both the white and black in himself, slitting the throat of the white mistress who valued his blackness. It's an assault on both parts of his racial identity. Chapter 6 takes us back to Joe Christmas's orphanage experience in Memphis and reveals a primal moment that helps to explain his contempt for women and his racial self-hatred, both of which, as I've suggested, culminate in the murder of Joanna. We begin with a reminder that the inheritances that motivate Joe Christmas trace back to his cultural past and his very earliest childhood. They are emotional and instinctive attitudes that shape his behavior years after, long, however, before they've occurred long before he can summon up any sense of the past. They originate at a time when memory seems almost not to operate at all and can be recalled, insofar as these things can be recalled, only in fragments and flashes. Faulkner tells us at the start, memory believes before knowing remembers, believes longer than recollects, longer than knowing even wonders, knows, remembers, believes, a corridor in a big, long, garbled, cold, echoing building of dark red brick, soot-blackened by more chimneys than its own, set in a grassless, cinder-strewn packed compound surrounded by smoking factory purlieu and enclosed by a 10-foot steel and wire fence like a penitentiary or a zoo, wherein random erratic surges with sparrow-like child trembling, orphans in identical and uniform blue denim, in and out of remembering, but in knowing, constant as the bleak walls, the bleak windows, wherein rain soot from the yearly adjacent chimneys streaked like black tears. Faulkner's narrator presents the primal moment that Christmas absorbs in his instinctive or emotive memory in a way that Joe Christmas probably could not consciously formulate at all in an act of recall. And insofar as he could at all, it would come only in flashes or bits and fragments, because it traces back to the very earliest period in his life, and the emotional memory traces back even before he was born. But the specific event that occurs that is so seminal in his very early years at the orphanage occurs when he enters a dietitian's room and consumes her toothpaste. As he sits behind a curtain, Joe inhales the female smells in the dietitian's room, and he feels pleasantly sequestered in this sensuous, almost womb-like place as he consumes her toothpaste. But then she enters with a doctor who wants her to have clandestine sex, and Joe overhears this. He was safe now behind the curtain. When they went away, he would replace the toothpaste and also leave, so he squatted behind the curtain. "No, Charlie, please," the woman said. The man's words he could not understand at all. The voice was lowered, too. It had a ruthless sound, as the voices of all men did to him. Yet, since he was too young yet to escape from the world of women for that brief respite before he escaped back into it to remain into the half-hour of his death, he stayed. He was not listening. He was just waiting, thinking, without particular interest or attention, that it was a strange hour to be going to bed. Again the woman's fainting whisper came through the thin curtain. "I'm scared. Hurry, hurry," as it appears now that they are actually going to have sex. He squatted among the soft, woman-smelling garments and the shoes. He saw by feel alone now the ruined, once cylindrical tube. By taste and not seeing, he contemplated the cool, invisible worm as it coiled onto his fingers and smeared sharp, automaton-like, and sweet into his mouth. There is an unmistakable erotic component to what Joe is experiencing here. He knows he is trespassing by being in this woman's room, and that combines with the sexual gratification he feels in eating the toothpaste in a way that he doesn't fully understand, but certainly experiences with a kind of naughty delectation. The 5-year-old boy takes oral pleasure, which is a form of sexual pleasure, in this toothpaste. He is a child, remember, whose mother died delivering him, who was never nurtured, therefore, at her breast, but who enjoyed the maternal kindness of a 12-year-old girl before she left the orphanage. So he longs, in short, for the oral pleasure associated with maternity, something he never received. Thus, the oral pleasure is part of the sensual gratification of eating this toothpaste. But the coiling of the toothpaste as, quote, a pink worm, combined with the female odors of the dietitian's room, suggests that there is also a kind of early phallic pleasure involved here for young Joe, 5 years old. Sitting, listening to the whispers of the adults, even though he doesn't consciously understand what they're discussing or why you would go to bed in the middle of the afternoon, notwithstanding that, he seems to forge a kind of instinctive association between his own forbidden sexual gratification with the toothpaste and what they are doing, their erotic gratification. More important, Joe associates his transgressive pleasure with a certain kind of unpleasure that follows, the scolding he receives when he vomits and is then discovered. For some time now, we're told, he had been doing nothing but sweating. And then after he vomits, at once the paste, which he had already swallowed, lifted inside him, trying to get back out into the air where it was cool. It was no longer sweet. In the rife, pink woman-smelling obscurity behind the curtain, he squatted, pink-foamed, listening to his insides, waiting with astonished fatalism for what was about to happen. Again, the sense even then of destiny. What was about to happen to him? And then it happened. He said to himself with complete and passive surrender, well, here I am. When the curtain fled back, he did not look up. When hands dragged him violently out of his vomit, he did not resist. He hung from those hands, limp, looking with slack-jawed and glassy idiocy into a face no longer smooth, pink and white, surrounded now by wild and disheveled hair whose smooth bands once made him think of candy. "You little rat!" the thin, furious voice hissed. "You little rat, spying on me!" Consider the nexus of association that forms here in Joe Christmas's mind, and which, though he may never be able to recall them consciously, are obviously forged very deeply, so much that these associations shape his future. First, he links the misery of sickness, of vomiting, not only with his sexual pleasure, but also with women and with food, both of which he later regards with repugnance. In fact, years later, Joe will only eat when he absolutely has to, because he associates food with sex and with women and with guilt for what he has done in this transgressive moment. Indeed, he expects, feeling guilty, to be punished for his crime. In fact, he wants to be punished. But instead of administering punishment, the dietitian, Miss Atkins, merely chides him for spying on her and calls him a little black bastard. Instead of striking him after pulling him out, she watches him because, quote, she foisted upon him the attributes of an adult. And so she offers Joe bribes to remain quiet about something that he doesn't consciously understand, this assignation. Joe rejects the silver dollar that she offers as a bribe because he senses it is somehow wrong, dishonest. It's a coercive offering that, in its dishonesty and manipulation, only compounds his feeling of guilty transgression when what he wants is to be punished for it. He was still with astonishment, shock, and outrage. Looking at the dollar she offered, he seemed to see ranked tubes of toothpaste like corded wood, endless and terrifying, his whole being coiled in a rich and passionate revulsion. "I don't want no more," he said. "I don't never want no more," he thought. He doesn't want any more toothpaste, and he doesn't want this money. He associates both the toothpaste and the money with women, with a certain kind of dishonesty, and with his own sickness. Well, looking at the boy's responses to the dietitian, I think, we can see the origins of his hatred of Joanna that I have just described, because the two women have much in common. First, he hates them both for being sexually enticing and corrupt. Second, he hates them both for trying to control and to dominate him, either with seduction in Joanna's case, or bribes in the dietitian's, or later religion in Joanna's case. And third, he hates them both for being deceitful, for being dishonest. He doesn't believe in Joanna's genuine religiosity, and he realizes that there is something dishonest in this dollar that he's been offered. It's a bribe. But finally, he hates them both for calling attention to his blackness. Without any basis other than what she'd heard other children say, Miss Atkins, the dietitian, accuses Joe of being black when she finds him behind the curtain. This causes him, then, to devalue the black part of himself before he even knew that it was there. But that remark also forges in his mind an association between women and blackness, which we saw during his walk in Freedtown, when that hypersensual and corrupt world seemed to him simultaneously black and feminine. But even before the dietitian discovered Joe behind that curtain and pulled him out, but did not punish him, even before that, we see something much more intrinsic in Joe Christmas that seems to antedate his arrival at the orphanage and possibly to antedate even his emergence into the world, so deeply rooted as it seemed to be in his DNA from the start. It is Joe Christmas's lifelong impulse toward both rebellious transgression and self-punishment. And the two, of course, are co-functional. Always the desire to strike out against authority and against others carries with it a need to lacerate oneself. Even at the age of 5, as he sits there with the toothpaste, Joe knows that he is doing something wrong. And like Zeno with his father's cigars, he therefore, knowing this and taking pleasure in it and knowing it's wrong, makes himself sick as a punishment for it. He eats the toothpaste even when he doesn't want any more, precisely in order to make himself sick. As he sits there sweating, he was not hearing anything at all now. Very likely he would not have heard a gunshot beyond the curtain. He seemed to be turned in upon himself, watching himself sweating, watching himself smear another worm of paste into his mouth, which his stomach did not want. Sure enough, it refused to go down. He's doing it only to punish himself for what he's already eaten illicitly. And note again, he's already watching his own body here, much as we're told that in the darkness, not long before he kills Joanna Burden, Joe Christmas watches and feels his own body. Now, you'll note here that, unfortunately, the nausea that Joe instinctively invokes and the vomiting that he uses to punish the sin that he feels he's committing only compounds his guilt, because his vomiting disturbs Miss Atkins, and Joe then, compounding the sin he feels because of disturbing her, waits for her then to punish him, desires for her to punish him. But it is a punishment that he needs that she never delivers. She foisted upon him the attributes of an adult, and as a result, he was the one who had been taken in sin, he thought, and was being tortured with punishment deferred. And he was putting himself in her way in order to get it over with, get his whipping and strike the balance and write it off. In order to atone for the guilt he feels, he needs to be beaten, and she will not do it. Instead of the punishment that he craves, Miss Atkins tries to get the janitor, after the bribe, Miss Atkins tries to get the janitor, who she has seen watching Joe Christmas closely, to help her expose his mixed race, or what is assumed to be his mixed race, and shipped off to a Negro orphanage, a place, quote, where he would be punished for having given her terror and worry. This is all self-protected because she fears that Joe will describe what he had heard behind the curtain. Well, the janitor, we later learn, is a man named Doc Hines, and indeed he has been watching Joe because it was he who delivered Joe secretly 5 years earlier to the Memphis orphanage. Hines is Joe Christmas's grandfather. Hines's daughter Millie gave birth to Joe and died in childbirth because Hines refused to call a doctor when he found out that the father of this child was part black. And yet, paradoxically, Hines not only saves Joe's life, but helps him pass for white at the orphanage, at least up until the point in which Miss Atkins accuses him. But Hines rejects Miss Atkins' plan to have Joe shipped off as black. He denounces her instead as a whore for her bitchery and demands that she wait and suffer for her lustfulness in a state of agonizing fear. He says to her with his cold, mad gray eyes that did not even seem to see her, but to look at her at all, he says, "If the Lord himself come into this room of one of you," he said, "you would believe he come in bitchery." Even if Christ came down, there would be you would believe that he came somehow for sex. So corrupted and infiltrated with lust are you. Now, Hines's own crime was, of course, letting his daughter die. But he sees Joe Christmas both as God's instrument of punishment for Atkins and to some extent for himself, but he also sees him at the same time, this child, as an embodiment of the evil of miscegenation, a child who is paradoxically then one whom he protects only so that God can then later on inflict on Joe his own special punishment for his biracial origins. He protects him so that God can then in some way punish Joe as only God can and should do it. Man, he believes, is unworthy of that special punishment. In the meantime, then, Hines, who wants to preserve the illusion that Joe is white, seeks to perpetuate that. Thus, he abducts Joe and takes him on the train to Arkansas after this encounter with Miss Atkins that threatens to expose Joe's black blood. And Hines tries to put Joe in another white orphanage before Atkins can tell the matron that Joe, in fact, may have black blood. Now, Joe has sensed a peculiar familiarity with this old man because he has buried memories, again, not conscious ones, but submerged memories, emotive or instinctive memories, if you will, of being dropped off at the orphanage by Hines in his infancy. Thus, this peculiar sense of familiarity. The surprise would have been the matron's if she had known how well he did know this man. But the man was a more definite person than anyone else in Joe's life, not accepting the girl Alice. Even at 3 years of age, the child Joe knew that there was something between them, himself and this man, that did not need to be spoken. He knew that he was never on the playground for an instant, that the man was not watching him from the chair in the furnace room door, and that the man was watching him with a profound and unflagging attention. Well, Light in August is full of paradoxical characters who are torn between opposing impulses that generate contradictory behavior. But Doc Hines is the most extreme example. He is a Calvinist zealot who preaches white supremacy in, of all places, black churches, yet he tries to conceal and protect the racial identity, the blackness, of his grandson, whom he despises as an abomination, so that God can, in time, exact punishment upon him. We find in Hines one of several illustrations in the novel of the perversion of Christianity, particularly in its fundamentalist Protestant manifestations. Hines believes that God's will and the Bible's teaching demand the suppression of blacks. We'll see other perversions in this same Calvinist Presbyterian religion shortly in McGurkin, who adopts Joe soon after he is returned to the orphanage. From their first meeting, Joe is moved to resistance and rebellion against McGurkin, this man of cold, brutal, rigid Calvinist piety. As he looks Joe over, he says in the orphanage, "I've no doubt the tyke will do. He will find a good home with Mrs. McGurkin and me. He will grow up to fear God and abhor idleness and vanity. And despite his origin." A little bit later, we are told of this same experience, he tells Joe, I will have you learn soon that there are two abominations. They are sloth and idle thinking. The two virtues are work and fear of God. And there was one other thing which he was not to remember until later, when memory no longer accepted his face, accepted the surface of remembering. And it was this. And then it came from McGurkin. Christmas, a heathenish name, sacrilege. I will change that. Well, rebellious by nature, as I had suggested, Joe is almost from birth. He knows inwardly, without thinking it, that no sooner has he heard that he will no longer be called Christmas than he will, in fact, cast off the name McGurkin, and that he will do so, and that before long he will run away. Because even immediately after McGurkin takes him and makes this statement, we're told, Joe didn't even bother to say to himself, my name ain't McGurkin, my name is Christmas. There was no need to bother about that yet. There was plenty of time. And yet it's, again, an attitude, a feeling, not a conscious articulation, but again, a sense of destiny of what he knows will happen. What Joe doesn't say to himself in thought or words, you'll note here, my name ain't McGurkin, my name is Christmas, that statement is printed in italics. There are, in fact, three different ways that Faulkner's narrator presents the interior life of his characters, and that is one of them. Let me explain. The first and most notable way in which he presents internal experience is through direct discourse, in which Faulkner uses quotation marks to present the thoughts of characters in language. As, for example, before the murder, Joe tells himself, maybe I already done it. It's a direct discourse, a voice spoken in language inside Joe Christmas's mind. A second method of representing interior thought and experience is indirect discourse, in which the narrator offers a close third-person summary of a character's thoughts in language not identical with, but close to, the character's own words, but without using quotation marks. For example, of the dietitian, we're told, quote, she believed that Joe not only intended to tell, but deferred deliberately in order to make her suffer more. Okay? She doesn't state this to herself in these words, but it's close to her own thought. The third interior technique is the one that we find when Faulkner inserts passages in italics. For the most part, that typeface indicates that the passage expresses what a character is feeling and what he or she would say if they could put that feeling into words, and in some cases, if they could put that instinctive memory into words. It's the narrator's translation of what they would say to themselves if they could. For example, when Joe sees Hines watching him, we get the following representation of what Joe Christmas as a child is experiencing in this italicized passage. He sees the man watching him. He hates me and fears me, so much so that he cannot let me out of his sight. Then, we're told, with more vocabulary, but no more age, he might have thought, and then again in italics, this is why I am different from the others, because he is watching me all the same. Okay? If Joe, as a child or ever, could recall this experience and frame it in this vocabulary, this is what it would be. But of course he can't, so the narrator does it for him. On other occasions, the italicized passages transmit not a feeling, as they do here, or a sense, but a mental image that can't be formulated in words. For instance, when the dietitian is thinking of how she'll prove that Joe is racially different from the other children at the orphanage to back up her accusation, we get the following statement in italics, quote, he will look just like a pea in a pan full of coffee beans. It's not that this is how she necessarily expresses it to herself in words. No, it's rather a kind of image in her mind, a pea among coffee beans. All right, to conclude, Chapter 7, in it, the chronicle of Joe's life at McGurkin's begins with the italicized passage of Joe Christmas. Now, now transmitting into language the following inexpressible feeling. Quote, "On this day, I became a man." What's happened? Well, it's not that he's spoken this to himself, it's what he feels. Looking back 20 years, and without formulating this as a thought in words, Joe Christmas remembers that his manhood began with his first act of rebellion, of resistance against the tyrannical McGurkin, and it happened when Joe was 8. He conceives of manhood, Joe does, as rebellion, and it begins here. Or really, it began earlier. I suppose you could argue his urge to rebellion began with the transgression with the toothpaste, but as a form of masculine self-assertion, it begins here. On a Sunday morning, Joe refuses to memorize his Presbyterian catechism. As he resists McGurkin's order that he do so, the man times him with his silver watch to give him time to memorize it and recite it, and when Joe refuses repeatedly, he beats him. He beats him twice for refusing to comply. The ticking watch reminds us that this seminal event and its consequences are going to be folded into Joe's own experience of time, into the entire temporal experience of his life. The ticking watch reminds us that this moment is going to shape his future. Well, the ordeal ends in the barn when, after a second beating, Joe collapses and feels nonetheless that he has won a victory over tyranny. Later, he finds himself in bed, and McGurkin comes in and asks God's forgiveness for beating the boy, but also asks God for the salvation of Joe's sinful soul. Joe lies in bed, and McGurkin began to pray. He prayed for a long time, his voice droning, soporific, monotonous. He asked that he be forgiven for trespass against the Sabbath and for lifting his hand against a child, an orphan who was dear to God. He asked that his child's stubborn heart be softened and that the sin of disobedience be forgiven him also, through the advocacy of the man whom he had flouted and disobeyed, requesting that Almighty God be as magnanimous as himself, and by, through and because of his conscious grace. The scene clearly informs Joe's hatred of Joanna Burden for similarly praying over him as a sinner and a reprobate in need of God's forgiveness. And she does it in the same coercive way that McGurkin does here, though Joe believes in a less sincere fashion. And yet, despite this antagonism and hatred, McGurkin has unmistakably influenced Joe. And this inheritance from McGurkin, Joe's enemy, is complex and ironic. From McGurkin, Joe has acquired the habit of cold brutality, as he demonstrates when, for example, he smacks Brown periodically. More important, Joe's own militancy in resisting McGurkin's religion reflects the same stubborn and perverse rigidity that his foster father displays in that proselytizing. It's as if Joe's resistance is in some way a mirror reflection of the willful proselytizing force of the father figure. We're told there was a very kinship of stubbornness in the two of them, like a transmitted resemblance in their backs. They went on, walking to the barn in a single steady file, their two backs in rigid abnegation. And when the strap fell on Joe, he did not flinch. No quiver passed over his face. He was looking straight ahead with a rapt, calm expression like a monk in a picture, or Mike McGurkin himself, as McGurkin began methodically and coldly to strike him with slow, deliberate force, the same slow, deliberate force Joe himself will use. Well, as I've noted at the start of this lecture, at such moments, Faulkner deliberately calls our attention in this kinship to the oscillating similarities that link even his most antagonistic characters. Okay, we'll pick up there next time. Have a good weekend.